Hello, hoop heads, and it's 100 degrees, and Jersey Jump Shot is back. This is a special edition of the first and only podcast dedicated to talking college hoops in the Garden State. And why are we doing one in late June? Well, we're on the cusp of a historic NBA draft for Jersey college players with two Ruckers guys expected to go high in the first round, and the Ruckers and Seton Hall rosters are finalized or close enough to it where we can really talk about them. I want to bring on a special guest, a very special guest, our old friend, Alex Schiffer, who covered the Nets for The Athletic and now is a reporter for Front Office Sports, which is an authority on the business of sports. He's a St. Joe's high school grad who was in school with Karl-Anthony Towns. More on that in a bit. He's a Westfield man, a Jersey and through like myself. He got his start as a contributor to the old Hoops Haven blog, RIP, before moving on to the big time. Alex, welcome home.
Thank you for having me, man. As I said before, I feel like I don't have a career without you, and I'm a proud member of your coaching tree, or coaching forest. I don't know how big it is.
You would have made it one way or another, but yes, I'm very, very proud and pleased to have played a small part in helping you get your start, Alex. Let's jump right in. I know you're a super busy guy. What do you think? We're going to talk draft first. What do you think is really going on with Ace Bailey?
Yeah, I think that he's trying to maybe handpick his destination a little bit. The top three in the draft lottery this year is interesting. The teams that got the best picks didn't intentionally tank, right? The Mavericks had a slew of injuries and the Luka Doncic trade. They get the top pick. The Spurs would have probably been a play-in team if Victor Wembanyama didn't have the blood clots. And then the Sixers had all those injuries and went up to 3. And I think that his camp is kind of looking at the situation at 3 maybe and maybe not in love with the Sixers idea, given that they're still contending. He probably doesn't have as big of a role immediately as he does with some of those other teams. And I think that they're trying to maybe make him like a man of mystery a little bit or trying to rub other teams the wrong way just to try and get him to a certain spot. The draft is a sliding scale with the money, though, too. He stands to lose, $20 million if he falls to 8 with the Nets or something like that. And, I also think I don't know his agent personally. I just know his agent isn't established as, a Mark Bartelstein of Priority or, like a Leon Rose type with CAA, who obviously now runs the Knicks. His agent on Real GM only has himself, has Ace Bailey, a G League player, and then like a guy over in Europe. And I kind of wonder if his lack of clientele and maybe having been around the block a little bit before with some of this stuff is a factor as well. So I think he's trying to play some hardball or try to get some teams to maybe pass on him, but I don't necessarily know if that's the best. And not working out for teams, I don't know if it's the best move either. So we're going to see tomorrow night if this works out for him.
I feel kind of bad for Ace on a personal level because although I didn't get to know him all that well, we only had a few months with him, he struck me as a nice guy, like a fun-loving, happy-go-lucky 18-year-old, And so I remember asking him, so after the Seton Hall game, he got dunked on by Chauncey Jenkins, like posterized by Chauncey Jenkins, who's like 4 or 5 inches shorter than he is. And I asked him about it, and you don't know how someone's going to react to that, right? And he was great about it. He's like, hey, man, everybody in this game gets dunked on at one time or another. Like, you're not playing the game right if you're not in that kind of position. And so he was cool about it. So, again, this is a little example. I don't think he's a bad guy, but I think the public at large thinks that Ace Bailey is like a malcontent. I don't know that that's true. Like you said, these are some dangerous games. Maybe his agent's playing. What do you think of him as an NBA prospect, Alex?
Yeah, I think that talking to some scouts around the pre-draft, there's a bit of a gap between him and Dylan Harper, but that's not a knock on him. I think Dylan Harper has a couple things going for him, and I think being the son of a former pro certainly helps. Obviously his dad had a great career, and I think there was a great story out by Yahoo last year about Bronny James and how the average NBA player has a career that's X amount of years long, and the average NBA player whose dad played has a longer career. So I think that history tells us that if your dad played, if the two things are even and you have some bloodlines from the game, I think that definitely helps you out. But I think that he's a project in the sense of, he has a lot of great tools. He has great size. He can handle the ball. He fits the modern game in a lot of ways, but he's still developing in a lot of different fronts. And the Dylan Harper's IQ and his feel for the game. And again, I think having dad helps him with some of those things too. I think maybe puts him a little bit above ace, but I think that he's still a very tantalizing prospect. And I understand, to play devil's advocate, I understand if you're in his camp how you can't replicate game experience. Him maybe playing for the Sixers isn't the best fit because they're trying to win immediately. It'd be more of a Kawhi Leonard type arc, right? You're Tim Duncan's right-hand man, and after he's gone, you become the guy. And obviously, it's harder to get max money and your best contracts if that's the case. But again, you're also in a winning environment. And you're not tanking and trying to throw games basically to get a higher draft pick per se. So I think I see where his camp is coming from in some ways, where it might be best for his development to not be in a situation like Philly. I also think there's a track record of guys who started out in smaller roles and gradually grew into them instead of having their feet thrown into the fire.
What do you think of Dylan Harper's fit in San Antonio if that comes to fruition, and how does he project? It sounds like you think he'll be a very, very good NBA player.
Yeah, I think he's very interesting because, they clearly know what they're doing in San Antonio. They're huge on player development. Even though Greg Popovich isn't coaching anymore, he says his fingerprints are still all over the franchise. Yeah. And you put him alongside Victor Wembanyama and De'Aaron Fox and Stephon Castle from UConn. I think that they have a very good young nucleus to grow around. And I think that he can definitely be, a top 3 player for them. And again, Stephon Castle and him are kind of interesting to me. There are 2 guards out of the Northeast who Stephon Castle is very athletic. Dylan Harper, I think, is very athletic, but also can hurt you in other different ways as well. I really like them keeping that core together and kind of seeing where it can go as some of these other guys in the West, like LeBron, Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, get older. So I'm really high on his career and the fit there. And I think, to your point, I'd be surprised if they don't take him there.
You're a Jersey guy, right? Westfield, grew up in Westfield, went to high school in Jersey, has lived here a long time, and I know you keep a close eye on college basketball here. What do you think went wrong with Ruckers this year from your seat? What did you see that went wrong for them with these 2 obviously super talented guys?
Yeah, obviously I'm not you and wasn't around. I was at a couple games this year, but I wasn't at all of them. First of all, to your point, I grew up watching a bunch of these guys leave the state, whether St. Joe's with that I thought Rutgers didn't recruit hard enough. Quentin DeCozy and Marcus Towns clearly proved at other schools that they belonged.
Right.
Given those were some of the Eddie Jordan coach Rutgers teams, and I think they were in the AAC a little bit, but clearly Quentin was a 1,000-point scorer at Temple, played in Europe for a while. Marcus was on the Loyola Final Four team. They could have used both those guys given what the talent was coming into the program. I think my 2 big picture thoughts on Rutgers are they obviously spent their entire NIL budget on getting Ace and Dylan. And I think what Steve Pikiell's calling card was before those guys were getting guys who outperformed their recruiting ranking or what, the services had on them. Ron Harper Jr., great example of that, right? I think that, you can go down the line on a lot of those guys from those Rutgers tournament teams with Steve Pikiell. And I think that because they blew the NIL budget on those 2, they didn't have a lot of those guys to maybe fill in the gaps and be great supporting players. When I covered Missouri when they had Michael Porter Jr., obviously he barely played for them, but they had a player named Cassius Robertson who came out of Canisius and offer out of high school, which was them, the Golden Griffins, and he played in Canada with Andrew Wiggins before Andrew Wiggins came to the States. And Cassius Robertson, this is pre-NIL, but Cassius Robertson basically came to Missouri because he knew Michael Porter Jr. would be good for his NBA stock. And again, I don't know who they looked at. I don't know everything, but right. I think if you were Steve Pikiell, basically, you could have found a couple guys like that and said, I don't have a lot of money for you, but you're about to make more money than you would staying here because you're about to get a lot of NBA exposure around these guys, and maybe you get a career in Europe out of this. Like I
sense that the dynamic with that has changed a little bit because now it's all over the table. Like guys can get paid over the table, and I think the dynamic has changed on that. And there's fewer players who are willing to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely think that's a harder bargain to sell now than the example I just used before it happened. But I think that there was just definitely that they had those 2, but they didn't have much else around them. And I also think that maybe, offensively, they could have done some things differently to try to find different ways to maybe lean on other guys or have it be different with those 2. But those are my two big picture thoughts on that. They just didn't have any of those guys that I thought were Steve Peichel guys from those early teams that got Rutgers turned around. And yeah, I think it's a big missed opportunity just because, again, I saw a bunch of guys leave the state. I remember Michael Kidd-Gilchrist telling me when he played at when I covered the Nets and he was on the Hornets, there's that famous St. Anthony's, St. Pat's game that took place at the Rack that they sold out.
Sure. Legendary.
And he always told me how that game always made him think that it didn't take much for Rutgers to just get a couple guys and start getting, he said that showed the appetite people have in Jersey for good basketball. And I think if they made the tournament this year, and they kept guys and made it, sealing the borders is overrated to me in the world of the portal. I think that whole stigma should go, on the wayside. Right. I'm using Missouri examples again because I follow the team still, but they have a wide receiver this year, Kevin Coleman from St. Louis. They missed out on him out of high school. They're getting him for his last year of eligibility. I think that the seal the borders talk has been right. It's a different definition than what you and I grew up on, but I do think if you can keep some of those guys home, given all the talent that comes out of here, you're cooking with gasoline. And I think that this was kind of a giant missed opportunity, and we'll see if they ever have another one with the way the modern game is.
You mentioned Quentin DeCozy. So I remember when he was at St. Joe's, I asked the Ruckers assistant coach what they thought about him, and he said, who? They wasn't even on their radar. And then Seton Hall recruited him. Kevin Willard recruited him and was very serious with him. And it came down to him and Brian Oliver, and they chose this other guy, wing Brian Oliver, who turned out to be a huge headache and a mistake. And both schools really blew it on Quentin DeCozy. It was terrific at Temple. So interesting there. All right. Two other guys, Jersey college players who we might hear their name as free agent signings or two-way type of guys. Does Kadari Richmond have a chance to catch on in the league, Alex?
I think he did. He had a good year at St. John's. I think Rick Pitino is very held in very high regard in the NBA. Obviously it didn't work out with him in the Celtics, but I think that some of his numbers do check out. He was a high scorer from inside the paint, not getting much from 3-point range, but I think that where Cliff and him are kind of in common. You know how like in football, like certain teams will draft a guy because he fits their offensive scheme and they have a certain package of plays for him. I think a team that really could use rebounding and maybe has a lot of 3-point shooting and, they draft Cliff or they sign Cliff and it's like, you either go back up with it or you're kicking it out. I think that he can really help a team on the boards. And again, I think Kadari, where you're looking for a different type of look offensively. If you have a lot of shooting and you don't really need that out of him and you can just have him go to the basket and do something off that, I think that those are where those guys are going to thrive. I think Kadari's lack of shooting, outside shooting, hurts him a bit. Right. But I think, again, like he does have the talent inside to get a look from somebody. And, again, I think Cliff, I think that they kind of have the same problem where they're good at a certain thing, but they're not
you can't shoot.
Exactly. And so I think that, rebounding translates a lot in the NBA, and I think that there are teams that really value that. And there are guys where you look at, again, there's a guy the Nets had when I covered him, Alize Johnson, was at Missouri State. Not a good outside shooter, not a great mid-range shooter, but he can rebound and he can clean it up down low. And he had a 5 or 6 year NBA career that most guys wouldn't have just from that. So I think that if Cliff can just kind of make rebounding his calling card, I think that there's a team that might appreciate that enough to give him a shot.
You think they'll get two ways or exhibit 10s, or will either of these guys get drafted late in the second round?
I think we'll see them at Summer League for sure and probably in a camp somewhere, and maybe one of them gets a two-way. This is a really weird NBA draft in that, it seems like there's a lot of talent in the first round and then really the second round more than most years. Below the 35th to 40th pick, I've had a couple scouts tell me that there might not be more than 40 NBA players in this draft. So wow. The second round is a crapshoot. I think that people really kind of overemphasize the second round with being taken or not. I know plenty of guys who had the option to get drafted and just decided to go undrafted and seek their own fate or right. team because it's not guaranteed money after a certain pick.
Right.
So I think that being I don't think those guys are top 60 players, but if they get drafted, sure, in those final 20 picks, which again doesn't really count for anything in my opinion. So I think they're on they're on teams' radars. I think we'll see them in training camp and on two right. ways, but I don't think, they're not guaranteed picks or anything like that the way Ace and Dylan are.
Right, probably not for sure. And then, so let's stay with college basketball. Where do you see college basketball going Alex, with the NIL and now the House settlement where schools can share revenue with the players? Like, do you see this as game-changing moment? Do you see this as more of the same? Like, what's going to happen with all these musical chairs, players changing teams like Sox, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I do think that it's kind of a pick your poison. I think what's going to change that might not have been happening with NIL is we never got to really see NIL contracts or who really got what. It was all a lot of hearsay, right?
Very much so, yes.
And I feel like, the way you got recruiting, the way you recruited players in the old times, when you saw a guy go somewhere at the last minute that maybe raise your eyebrows, well, he had a bag of money dropped on him, right?
Right.
And so, for this stuff to be above the table, well, like, Jerry Carino Jr. had 80,000 from Rutgers. He had 80,000 from Seton Hall, and then all of a sudden that he signed.
No, I'm worth more than that, brother.
I know. I'm just taking that easy. You're priceless, but like, and then as all of a sudden a guy goes to a school for less money. If you went to a school where you knew the only number they could give you was $50K, I don't believe that you didn't go there on a discount. Like I'm going to believe that like you took the $50K publicly, but there was something else promised under the table that they just didn't have to report.
Right.
So I do think that some of the cheating that used to be back in the day is probably going to come back because they're just not going to publicly report everything, or there's going to be some other kind of promise made. I do think it's good for college sports. I do think that, a lot of these kids have been used and not really properly compensated for years. I think that it's going to change, college sports as we know them, but it might not be a bad thing. I just think that the old-fashioned stuff that we grew up on is kind of a thing of the past, and we're never going back to that. The toothpaste is out of the tube, all those cliches.
But what will it take for Ruckers and Seton Hall to compete in this landscape?
Well, what's funny is like to tap into a former Westfield resident that you and I both know a bit, obviously Kevin Willard.
Yes.
I think that Kevin Willard is maybe one of the most interesting test cases for what we're talking about. And he doesn't strike me as someone in my time with him that would enjoy being a poster child or anything like that. But I think that that's
no question about it.
He left Maryland because he didn't enjoy the sharing the resources and the money and everything with football.
Right.
Maryland's a basketball school, and to me always will be, but you have to compete in football because they pay the bills.
Yes.
And I think that him going back to the Big East is going to see like, well, what age is better, Maryland basketball or Villanova basketball with him? Because in the Big East, basketball's king. They're getting the direct amount of money, and I think that will help Seton Hall in a lot of ways. Rutgers, to me, is kind of trying to be, it's tough for both sports to be good at the same time in Power 4 conferences. Florida, when they went back-to-back with Billy Donovan and also had Tim Tebow, to me, is the closest thing I can remember of, like, both sports that make money being elite at the same time in my lifetime. I'm sure there's other examples, but you get the point. The thing that I kind of think about with some of these schools that have been really good in basketball or had a lot of options behind them, Arkansas with John Calipari has Tyson Food Empire money and Walmart money. Like Missouri has a little bit of Walmart money. Fun fact, Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, went to Missouri, got to start selling ads at the school paper.
There you go. Fun fact.
St. John's has had vitamin water money, right?
Right.
I have no idea like where the Seton Hall and Rutgers alums that aren't in sports are doing with themselves, but I almost feel like they need some alum that has some oil money of sorts to tap into like these other schools do to kind of help them offset some of the money with revenue sharing to make up with these other schools. I think the biggest gift, as we've seen and I've written a lot about, James Harden, as I wrote about in February, basically paid for Arizona State's roster this year. Then you see schools like Trae Young adding, like Oklahoma, where Trae Young played, adding him as an assistant GM partially for his NBA earnings, right?
You wonder if Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey down the road could fund some stuff for Rutgers. That's a good point.
Exactly. I think the biggest gift that Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper can give Rutgers, given that it didn't work out in their 1 year here, is one day they're taking a super max contract or a max contract, which with the way the NBA cap's going is going to be for a ton of money. It wouldn't surprise me if either of those guys are making $60 million plus a year in a couple years with their second contracts if they live up to the hype. And you do the math, Jerry, a month's interest at least in this current time, we haven't adjusted for college sports inflation, as I call it, but like a game check, a month's interest off of that contract, that they give that to Rutgers, and that can go a really long way. And that's where I think that, if you're Steve Peichel and you're still the coach at Rutgers when those guys are getting the paychecks like that, I think that's the hope. And, Seton Hall hasn't really had that guy.
The closest guy they have right now is Mamu. He's with the Spurs.
Yes, and he's not making, he's 5, 6, 7 million, I think, or something like that.
Right.
He's like a mid-level type guy. He doesn't have those kind of career earnings. And I think that's, Seton Hall's problem is that can they find somebody, if Miles Powell worked out in the pros and that lawsuit never happened, that's a couple of what ifs. But
right.
I think that, Angel Delgado.
That's a good point. Alumni giving back, bringing them in, getting them involved as assistant GMs or stuff like that is fascinating potential wave of the future. Interesting.
Exactly. I think that those guys that's the best thing that can happen with them in Rutgers basketball going forward is they sign for a whole lot of money. They only have to give a fraction of it back to the school. Again, laws are changing constantly. What if NIL donations become a tax write-off in New Jersey? That might be more appetizing to them or whatever state. So
fascinating.
I think that is what, if I were Steve Peichel and going to church, that's what I'd pray for after those guys get drafted, is that they live up to their hype. They get the Supermax money down the road that's going to be gigantic money like current NBA players aren't even making with the new cap that's going to be.
Right.
And that those guys are back involved with the program and helping them get the players that they could that rival their talent coming out of high school and the supporting cast they lacked when they were there.
Great point. All right, give me 2 minutes on Karl-Anthony Towns. What did you make of his debut season with the Knicks and the playoff run that they had? And then the unfortunate, in my opinion, heat that he caught from their fans. Give me your Karl-Anthony Towns Knicks take as someone who knows him better than anybody.
It's nice to have him back. He's left tickets for some friends of mine, which I think has been very cool. They had the best run the team's had since Bill Clinton was our president. I think it's hard not to think it was a bit of a success. I think the Pacers were an absolutely tremendous team. They had some March Madness vibes to me where, the Knicks were better on paper, but the Pacers were better as a whole than the sum of their parts.
They were clicking big time.
Yes, and that Tyrese Halliburton shot that went and got kissed by the basketball gods before it fell through. If the first 2 games of the series go differently, the Knicks might have still been playing it up until Sunday. And I think it's hard not to like where they sit right now. Jason Tatum Achilles, Tyrese Halliburton Achilles. The Eastern Conference, the Knicks and the Cavaliers bring the most back from a health perspective and a continuity standpoint. And I think that they should be right back there in the conference finals next season. As for the heat he caught, I definitely think that there were times where, he wasn't being aggressive enough or they weren't going to him as much. And, the Tibbs benching of him in that game where it was like an 8-minute sit or whatever was baffling to me. But, this is the Knicks. It's one of the biggest fan bases in all of sports. It's the playoffs. These fans haven't tasted success like this in a very long time, as you and I are saying. And I think that's, you're always going to get some flack and fair undeserved. It's kind of what you sign up for.
Right.
And I'm really curious to see what they do with this coaching hire because the window is now. It's tough for a coach to kind of come in and have to do that immediately. Usually you need some time with this stuff. And they're hiring a guy to win right now, given the landscape of the Eastern Conference and of this team as it's constructed. And it's funny, I haven't seen Karl talk about any of this stuff, but, Karl, I know, visited Villanova a number of times when we were in school, and some of those guys that were on the team with him were on the current roster. So he's not a Villanova Knick, obviously, but he's like an adopted one to me or like a distant cousin, given I know he took a couple visits there. So, so I'm curious to see where it goes for him, but I think – I think it's funny that the Minnesota Timberwolves traded him and they both wound up in the conference finals. You don't really see a trade that big be kind of a success for both teams in that way that quickly.
It's been good. And as someone who knows Karl, it's been fun to have him back and see him. He kind of feels like he belongs here. I know it's a tough market, but this is home for him. And it's been fun to see him come back home just from a personal perspective.
Yes, it would have been nice if it worked out a bit better with his dad as coach. We needed Karl, I guess, as assistant GM of St. Joe's basketball. To buy us some players. I don't know if they would have been cool with that at the school. I would have been. But
with Alex, you get a little NBA talk, you get college talk, and you get St. Joe's Metuchen high school talk.
Yeah.
It's good to have you back, Alex. We got to have you on as an annual fixture on this podcast. I thank you for squeezing me in on short notice. Proud of everything you've accomplished. Keep doing what you're doing, and I'll see you down the road.
For sure, man. I'm always happy to help you. I owe my career to you.
All right, good man, Alex Schiffer, the front office sports, covering the business of sports with a special eye on the NBA. He's done great things. The pride of Westfield. Thanks, Alex. All right, more to talk about on the Jersey jump shot. I got a few things for you. We want to get into what has happened in college basketball with the rosters. We'll do a little schedule talk. I got a hit list I want to run down. I want to speak generally first about the free agent period that is just wrapped up, that both Ruckers and Seton Hall were rebuilding large parts of their rosters. Ruckers retained 4 guys. Seton Hall retained 2 guys. Ruckers is bringing in 6 freshmen, including 2 from Europe. Seton Hall is bringing in no freshmen. So interesting, different approaches. Seton Hall still heavy on the transfer route. Ruckers less so this year with just 3 transfers. Just to give you an idea of what happened, and people have asked me, well, why do Ruckers and Seton Hall, why do their rosters not look like much? Why did they not bring in, established high major players or mid-major standouts? Here's the best answer I can give you. And again, a lot of this stuff is still shrouded in secrecy, opaque, non-transparent, and the information you get is not always on the money. There's agendas involved. So we do the best we can at sifting fact from fiction or fiction from what's plausible. Here's what I can tell you. Seton Hall and Ruckers both recruited a guy by the name of Chris Bell. Syracuse transfer, 6'7". This past season averaged 9.3 points per game, 2.0 rebounds. He shot 35% from three-point range, which is okay. Finished the year shooting pretty well. Better than that from 3. He had shot better the year before. Not a good defensive player, poor defensive player. Syracuse was not any good this past year. Seton Hall and Ruckers both recruited this guy. They wanted him. They were very interested in him. He winds up at Cal. $1.5 million is the number I heard, verified from a couple of different people. $1.5 million. So if you're Steve Peichel or Sheen Holloway, and you have, I'm going to just ballpark, you have $4 million to work with, right? Steve, Ruckers had $3 to $3.5 million of rev share, plus a few $100,000 in NIL, maybe $500,000 in NIL, ballparking $3.5 to $4 million Ruckers had for their roster this year. Not counting the Vegas money, which they were not able to really use at the moment because that money don't get it until December. And we'll get into the reasons why that didn't help them as much as you might think in a minute. If you're Seton Hall, it's a source of great contention. How much did they actually have? I'm going to work with the number of $4 million, okay, that they had a $4 million budget. I'm going to work with that for now. We'll get back more into the details of that in a minute. So if you're Ruckers and Seton Hall and you had $4 million or thereabouts, maybe a little less for Ruckers, and Chris Bell is demanding $1.5 million. That's well over a third of your entire roster budget for a guy who averages 9 points a game, did not play good defense, and shoots a three-pointer fairly well, not scorching hot well, okay, and has been sort of very streaky as a three-point shooter. You're going to devote more than a third of your budget to this one guy? So, no, you're not going to do that. No responsible coach would do that. And so that's why they didn't get this guy. I'll give you another guy. Played for St. John's. Simeon Wilcher, 6'4" guard, 8 points a game, 2 rebounds a game, 1.4 assists. He shot 29% from three-point range this past season. He did shoot it very well. The previous season as a freshman, I think 40%-ish. Good defensive player, as everyone on St. John's was, and he contributed to them having this Big East champion sensational season, okay? So the word on the street is that Wilcher was looking for $2 million. There's a local guy who you think, they can keep him home. He was a role player at St. John's. But again, $2 million is that's half your budget if you're Ruckers and Seton Hall. How are you going to do that? He winds up in Texas. I don't know what he actually got, but that's the word that you're hearing. And again, without transparency, all I can go with here is the word that we're hearing. But St. John's, we're hearing, has over $10 million starting lineup. Okay. So that dwarfs what Seton Hall and Ruckers have for their entire budget. Now that's one school, obviously a high-end school, but you get the idea. This is Cal. These are Cal and Texas who wind up paying these guys what would be just an astronomical chunk of Seton Hall and Ruckers budgets. So this is what they're up against. Lathan Somerville, 6'10" center at Ruckers, 8 points, 4 rebounds a game this year. Did not play any defense, as many freshmen don't. Didn't pass the ball particularly well. $1 million to Washington. That's in that ballpark to go to Washington. It's just not tenable for Ruckers to spend that money in that spot for a guy who doesn't protect the rim, which is what Ruckers needs schematically. $1 million, that's, 25 to 30% of Ruckers' budget on one guy who's not a superstar and who doesn't do what they need. Just another example. Manny Okorafor was a center at Seton Hall this year who was bad. He was bad, okay? He had one good game against Ruckers. Otherwise, he was bad. Didn't defend, didn't score, didn't rebound, didn't really do anything. $600,000 was what he was looking for. I don't know what he actually got. $600,000 is the asking price. $600,000. I mean, why would Seton Hall spend that money? So you wonder why people are leaving. You wonder why, they don't have high impact players, because this is what the market inflated to. And I can't speak for the Seton Hall and Rutgers coaches, but I don't think anybody really, most people did not foresee the market inflating to this degree. Why did it inflate so much over last year? Because with the looming house settlement, there was like a big run on NIL collectives sort of unloading everything they had. Like everything they had in the kitty was unloaded for these top end players early on in the free agency period, because in theory, now that the house settlement is in effect, starting July 1st, all NIL deals have to go through an algorithm run by Deloitte to decide whether they're legit or not wanting to take that chance. A lot of the money was front loaded, okay? And so there was a big run on players at higher numbers than most people anticipated. So while you may say, like Seton Hall or Rutgers has $4 million, they should be able to get players. Well, they can get players, but the high impact players, no. High impact big men, $1.5 million and up. High impact, you have medium impact shooters, $1.5 million and up. That's a lot of money to spend on one player who's not an alpha, who's not, a go-to guy, or who's not proven to produce at a high level, at the high major level or mid-major star. That's a lot of your budget to invest in a player like that. And so another trend was the players wanting money up front. In the past, there was a lot of, we'll pay you when you get here. I think some coaches probably abused that. You've heard some stories about that. And this year there was a lot of, no, I don't commit until I get the money up front, until I get a signed contract up front, until I get a deal up front. I want the cash in hand. There was a lot of that. And so that made it even more difficult. So for Ruckers, for example, like they don't get their $1 million from the Vegas tournament until December. They don't get paid until December. The tournament's at the end. The Players Era Festival's at the end of November. So they don't get the money until December. That doesn't help you in April, in May, when you're building a roster. It doesn't help you unless someone agrees to take deferred payment, which, most players were not. And so if a player was agreeing to take a deferred payment, maybe they had fewer offers elsewhere, fewer opportunities to get paid up front elsewhere. They were a lesser player. You could get them for a deferred payment. That became an attractive reason to recruit them. But that $1 million didn't really help Rutgers a ton recruiting in this cycle for when players wanted the money up front, okay? And so that's another thing that came into play. So those are some general trends about free agency that you should know when you're wondering why Rutgers and Seton Hall have these rosters on paper that don't look very good. For Rutgers, we'll see it's very early. They've been working out for a week and a half. Not everyone's there yet. Dennis Badalow is still in Europe. He's got to get a visa. Who knows when that'll happen? There's a lot of politics involved there. I do get the impression that Ruckers feels like Emmanuel Ogboli is going to be their starting center, with Bay Fall, as sort of maybe platooning with him or backing him up. Manny's familiar with the system. This will be his third year at Ruckers. They feel like he's ready to take the next step as a defense and rebounding center, a rim protector. He's fully healthy, although he has not made it through a healthy season. That's a big concern, which is why you need a guy like Bay Fall to help out. But my theory is that Manny goes in as the incumbent starting center. Fall has to unseat him. We'll see if he does. They'll both play, obviously. And then Rutgers very high on Darren Buchanan. He's going to have a huge role. The defensive toughness piece that maybe Rutgers was lacking last year. that you become so accustomed to with Steve Pikiell teams. They feel like he could be that guy. Ruckers recruiting Eastern Europe with this guy Zerno, Harun Zerno from Bosnia. They feel like he could step in and help them right away. We'll see. Again, guy hitting shots in a gym in practice or in sort of a workout setting is a lot different than doing against high major competition. But these guys from Europe have played against, men. They've played against men. And so they're not really going to be your average freshman. That's the idea. Rutgers has 6 freshmen. That's a ton. They're very high on Chris Nwuli. I think he's got a chance to start or play major minutes right away. They see him as a lockdown defender. So Rutgers projects as much better, returning to their roots defensively. Will they be the great defensive teams Rutgers had in the past, under Steve Pikiell? We'll see. A lot of that depends on, Manny Agboli taking the next step as a rim protector. Obviously, they're going to go back to that style. I thought it was notable that Steve Pikiell went back to teaching, to installing into individual instruction, which he did not do last summer. He passed on individual instruction last summer. Obviously, that didn't work. He was trying to sort of speed install the team's defense and the team systems with guys he knew were only going to be there for a few months, Dylan and Ace. It didn't work. They went back to individual instruction this year. I think the hope really is that Rutgers can keep these guys, these young guys. This is a 2-year plan. No one is under the delusion you're going to keep guys for 4 years anymore. I think Rutgers is hoping they can keep these guys for 2 years. And by going back to individual instruction, they can develop this freshman class a little bit. And Rutgers' team is almost all underclassmen now. So I feel like this is sort of a 2-year project for Rutgers. It's a risky thing in this day and age, especially when Steve Pikiell doesn't know who his boss is, doesn't have a GM yet, which is a huge drop of the ball on Rutgers' part. They have no general manager. You absolutely have to have a general manager to help you with negotiations, the contracts that are coming into play. If you're going to have multi-year contracts, you need a general manager for this stuff to help you manage salary cap, to negotiate deals, to assess value. You need a general manager. There's a lot of legal stuff that goes on here. It's crazy not to have a general manager. Rutgers doesn't have one yet. The job hasn't been posted yet, or is just about to be posted. The Holloway, the previous president, Jonathan Holloway, put the kibosh on the posting of the job. It's just a mess. Again, a lack of vision or leadership. So they didn't have a general manager to help them in this cycle. Steve Pikiell, again, sort of wearing all those hats when a lot of his peers are not. And that's a disadvantage too. Rutgers, schedule-wise, what are we going to see from them? Schedule-wise, you're going to see 3 games in Vegas against quality opponents. I know they haven't released the matchups yet. There are some rumblings. You've heard some things. They're going to have some very good opponents one way or another. And then they're going to play at Seton Hall, and then they're going to play 7 bye games at the RAC. Gone is the Madison Square Garden neutral game. Gone is the crazy, trips to play teams out of the area, like you saw last year when Rutgers lost that game to Kennesaw. Those are gone. I don't think you'll see Princeton anymore, at least not in a neutral setting. If they come to the RAC, that's different. That's gone. Rutgers is going to just play their 3 games they're going to get paid for in Vegas. The Seton Hall rivalry will continue. It makes money. It makes money for the teams. The games sell out. The parking lot's full. The concessions are buzzing. The game makes money. It's a rivalry. The coaches like it. That game's staying. And then they're going to play 7 bye games, which in the past, people would have criticized that. Now it's what you have to do, man. You got to make money off your games, or you got to just beat up on teams for metrics purposes, and that's what Rutgers is going to do this year. So, all right, Seton Hall. The big question I get asked is how much money does Seton Hall actually have? So it depends, there are different factions. When you ask one faction at Seton Hall, they had plenty of money. When you ask another faction at Seton Hall, they didn't have enough money. Different, I think, agendas or thought processes or viewpoints there colliding, trying to sift it all out. I think it's somewhere in the middle. The answer is somewhere in the middle. Seton Hall was not prepared as Rutgers was, and as many places were not for the inflation that took place. They were, I think, stunned by it. Again, this is when we're not having a GM hurt. Seton Hall doesn't have a GM. They need a GM. They don't have one. They haven't replaced Mike McBride, who was their NIL guy. They're not going to replace him, it sounds like. They're not going to hire a GM, at least not in this cycle. So, that's a big hindrance. That's a big hindrance. Maybe a GM sees around those corners to know that inflation's coming, or that you need to, can we find creative ways to defer payments, find other ways? Have no GM to make it work. That's a huge hindrance. Like, coaches just cannot be wearing these hats. It's just too much. It's just too much. You need a GM. Call it something else if you want. GM doesn't have final say on the players. This isn't the NBA or pro sports, but you need a GM to work out a lot of the legal and financial stuff, or somebody, call them what you want, whatever you want. Okay. But you need that person, and Seton Hall doesn't have that person. Doesn't seem like they're going to hire that person. I think that's a mistake. Ruckers is going to hire one. They're dragging their feet on it. That's a mistake. So from best I can tell from talking to different people is, when we last spoke with Brian Felt, he said the Big East wanted schools to be in for between $4 and $8 million in roster building. Obviously, Seton Hall would be in that range. The feeling was Seton Hall would be in the middle of that range between revenue share and whatever NIL they did have. They'd be in the middle of that range. I don't think they got to the middle of that range, or if they did, they got there too late for Sheen Holloway to use that money early in the cycle, because the House settlement came in so late, and well after most of Seton Hall's roster was done. There's just no way Sheen Holloway had $6 million at his disposal at the beginning of this cycle, which is when most of this stuff happened. That's when you're losing your players who are transferring out. That's when your biggest signings are coming in, your biggest commitments are coming in. That first month, 6 weeks, that late March, April to mid-May period, before and right after the portal closes, that's when most of this stuff is settling. There's no way Sheen Holloway had $6 million to spend at that point. If they got there later, if after the House settlement came in, which was late, if he eventually got there, maybe that's true. And technically, maybe he had all that money at some point. But again, no one knows for sure. And I have to tell you, I feel bad for fans who are asking this stuff, but I have not had an interview with Sheen Holloway. I've been asking for one for weeks. I'm told I'll get one, but I don't know when. I keep hearing later. I've asked for a date. Can we put it on the calendar? I haven't gotten a date. And so at least at Ruckers, I've spoken with Steve Peichel. I've interviewed him. I have a sense for where they are. There's going to be some coach speak there, but if you know what to listen for, you can kind of discern what the state of things. Steve Peichel was saying our NIL is not where it needed to be. We're way behind, and they were. With Seton Hall, I haven't had that interview. I'm just disappointing that I haven't had it yet. I'm disappointed for you, your loyal readers, big Seton Hall fans, the diehard fans who follow, what I've written, what we've talked about over the years, who are listening now. I feel bad about it. This is the least access I've ever had at Seton Hall. I had to beg to see a practice last fall. I finally get into one right at the end, right before the season started. But I had to really beg, and I feel stupid begging. I've been doing this 22 years. You know who I am, what I'm about. I'm not going to burn anybody. I'm not going to blow places up. I'm fair. People know where to find me. Listen, my reputation is what it is. Okay. So that's no reason to keep me at arm's length, or I should not have to beg for an interview or to come to see the team at this point. I feel kind of stupid and sad and bad about it. For me, and what am I doing here? I'm 52 years old. Why am I begging for something like this? But also for you, especially for the people, for the fans and the diehard fans and the loyal readers who want to know what's going on. And I can't fully service you. I can't fully do my job on that front. And I feel bad about that. I'm doing the best I can to find out stuff. So that's my take on where their budget is. What I can tell you for sure is Bud Clark's really good. Seton Hall has a good point guard in Bud Clark. Saw him run rings around Dylan Harper. It was just one game with Merrimack, but I know Joey Gallo well. He has given a ringing endorsement for Bud as a fit for Seton Hall, as a sort of the playmaking point guard that they need, that they lacked. He will be a major upgrade on Garway Dual. There's no doubt in my mind. And, there'll be some adjusting. He's small. Seton Hall has had success with small point guards before. He doesn't shoot the lights out from three. He can get his shot and hit from the mid-range and get to the rim. It's harder in the Big East, of course, than it would have been in the MAC. But Seton Hall's had success with smaller guards, and they didn't know. Shaw didn't come in as a good shooter. He left as one. Andre Barrett got much better as a shooter at his time at the Hall. Jordan Theodore improved a ton as a shooter. So not all these guys came in as a great shooter. They got better as shooters, but I think Bud Clark is the least of Seton Hall's issues. I think he'll be very good at point guard. He'll hold his own. Will he be an all Big East point guard? I'm not going to tell you that. Will he hold his own? Yes, I believe he'll hold his own, and Seton Hall's offense will improve by default as a result. I know they were bad last year. The other guy I've heard good things about is TJ Simpkins. I know Greg Herenda, former FDU coach, Jersey guy, former Seton Hall assistant. He's down at Elon. He loved TJ Simpkins, loved the way he played, how tough he was, how he defended multiple positions, how he handled the ball, how he's a good passer, how he could score. Not a great shooter, but could score. A scorer, has his nose for scoring. He loves to fit with Sheen Holloway, and that's a big thing if you're Seton Hall. Like, the fit is important. Like, the personality fit's important if you're Sheen Holloway. You got to find guys who fit your personality and what you want to do. Last year, Seton Hall whiffed on a lot of the personalities. Guys didn't fit. They weren't taking the coaching. They weren't understanding what to do. They weren't grasping the concepts. Yeah, maybe guys, I'm not saying guys weren't playing hard, but playing hard is not enough. You have to play hard. You have to play smart. You have to accept your role. And so there was not a lot of that last year. A lot of the free agents transfer Seton Hall brought in did not fit personality-wise. And they wound up being busts personality-wise. So Seton Hall has to scout for that. And someone said to me last year, like, you get what you pay for. Seton Hall had low budget last year. They got a lot of low IQ players who had personalities, who were difficult, who, maybe weren't taking the coaching as well as they should have. Scotty Middleton's a guy who has a lot of talent, but why is he trying to check into a game without a jersey on? And then if he's getting criticized for that, why can't he handle that? I mean, you're in college, dude. You should have your jersey on the sideline. And so, like, you can't handle that, then you can't handle being here. You can't handle this level. So that's just a small example. Garway Duell, he's got a lot of natural talent and physical gifts. But if you can't grasp how to play, a matchup zone, if you can't follow instructions, follow rules, if you can't take coaching and accept your role and do what you're asked to do, then what good is that? And so these were bad fits who have moved on. And then, will the Seton Hall find better fits? We'll see. I don't know. I don't know most of these guys. I don't know much about them. What I can tell you is people I trust who've coached them told me Bud Clark and TJ Simpkins are great fits. So that's two backcourt pieces who I think will do well for Seton Hall and will contribute. That's 2 of 11 or 12 guys. There's a lot of mystery with the other players, and I understand why people are down on not knowing much about these guys after what happened last year. I do think with Seton Hall, you'll see the matchup zone. If you recall, if you watched Sheen Holloway closely, you know that they played matchup zone to great effect. With St. Peter's, he played a little bit 2 years ago, a little tough with the lack of bodies to keep up that intensity that he wanted, when they won 25 games. But I think you're going to see matchup zone, if not the base defense for Seton Hall, as a steady diet. Like, I know he really wants to play that, and they recruited players with an eye toward being able to execute that matchup zone. Smarter players. Maybe that's one of the things with the depth they were looking for to be able to run this matchup zone that was so good at St. Peter's, and is so good if you do it right. It's so good if you do it right. So that's something you could see this year. So keep an eye out for that. Seton Hall schedule, you're going to see, they're going to Maui. They'll have 3 decent to good games there at Maui. And then, of course, they'll host Ruckers at home in mid-December. No, we won't know the date for sure until the Devil schedule comes out. And then whatever else you see from Seton Hall schedule-wise, it's going to be they'll either have the bye games at home, or anything that else they play is going to be to make money. That game against Hofstra last year was an appearance fee game. Obviously, they lost. There was no one there. It turned out to be very unproductive. But you're doing these things for appearance fees. If you're Seton Hall and you need every dollar you can get, you're going to do things for appearance fees. There's been talk of maybe doing like a neutral type of game with a high major, like the game they played in Missouri a couple years ago, a high major on the West Coast for an appearance fee. I don't know where that's gone, if that's come to fruition or not. I heard some whispers about that. I know the Never Forget Tribute Classic, which plays at the Prudential Center, would love to get Seton Hall in a matchup with a Princeton or another notable mid-major, perhaps. There's an appearance fee to be had there, maybe several $100,000. Will that come to fruition? We'll see. But these are the types of games. If a game pops up in Seton Hall schedule, like, why are they doing this? It's going to be because there's an appearance fee involved, and they got to make money. So that's where we're at. Thanks to Alex Schiffer for coming on. A lot of question marks. I know this is the world of question marks, and that's what we're dealing with. I hope this was a little bit helpful for you. this is, these are Wild West times in college basketball, and we're all kind of going through it together. You, the fans, we, the media, and the coaches too. So hang in there. I hope you have a great summer. I hope your toes are in the sand. Mine will be soon enough after the NBA draft. Again, thanks to Alex Schiffer for coming on. Special edition, summertime, 100 degrees, Jersey jump shot. We'll see you again in the fall. Thanks as always for being with us.